And this starts off in that very situation, waiting for combat. I sat up for a long time that night, in the foreboding eve of battle mood of which all soldiers at all times have left report. On a tree stump clustered around with blue anemones, before I crept over the ranks of my comrades to the tent. I had tangled dreams in which a principal role was played by a skull. In the morning, the tender green of young leaves shimmered in the flat light. We followed hidden, twisting paths toward a narrow gorge behind the front line. On the dot of noon, our artillery launched into a furious bombardment that echoed and re-echoed through the wooded hollows. For the first time, we heard what was meant by the expression drum fire. We sat perched on our haversacks, idle and excited. A runner plunged through the company to the company commander. Brisk exchange. The 3 nearest trenches have fallen to us, and 6 field guns have been captured. Loud cheers rang out. A feeling of up and at 'em. At last, the longed-for order. In a long line, we moved forward toward the pattering of heavy rifle fire. It was getting serious. To the side of the forest path, dull thumps came down in a clump of firs, bringing down a rain of branches and soil. One nervous soldier threw himself to the ground. Then, death's call slipped through the ranks. Ambulance men to the front. A little later, we passed the spot that had been hit. The casualties had already been removed. Bloody scraps of cloth and flesh had been left on the bushes around the crater. A strange and dreadful sight that put me in mind of the butcher bird that spikes its prey on thorn bushes. We entered the battle-trampled realm of the infantrymen. The area around the jumping-off position had been deforested by the shells. In the ripped-up no-man's land lay the victims of the attack, still facing the enemy. Their gray tunics barely stood out from the ground. A giant form with red, blood-spattered beard stared fixedly at the sky, his fingers clutching the spongy ground. A young man tossed in a shell crater, his features already yellow with impending death. He seemed not to want to be looked at. He gave us a cross shrug and pulled his coat over his head and lay still. In a curious failure of comprehension, I looked alertly about me for possible targets for all this artillery fire, not apparently realizing that it was actually ourselves that the enemy gunners were trying for all they were worth to hit. Ambulance men! We had our first fatality. A shrapnel ball had ripped through Rifleman Stoltler's carotid artery. 3 packets of lint were sodden with blood in no time. In a matter of seconds, he bled to death. In the rising mist, I leapt out of the trench and found a shrunken French corpse. Flesh, like moldering fish, gleamed greenishly through slits in the shredded uniform. Turning around, I took a step back in horror. Next to me was a figure crouched against a tree. It still had gleaming French leather harness, and on its back was a fully packed haversack, topped by a round mess tin. Empty eye sockets and a few strands of hair on the bluish-black skull indicated that the man was not among the living. There was another sitting down, slumped forward towards his feet, as though he had just collapsed. All around were dozens more, rotted, dried, stiffened to mummies, frozen in an eerie dance of death. The French must have spent months in the proximity of their fallen comrades without burying them. A headless torso was jammed in some shot-up beams. Head and neck were gone. White cartilage gleamed out of a reddish-black flesh. I found it difficult to fathom. Next to this very young man lay on his back with glassy eyes and fists still aiming. A peculiar feeling, looking into dead, questioning eyes, a shudder that I never quite lost in the course of the war. His pockets had been turned inside out, and his empty wallet lay beside him. So that right there is a portion of the opening chapters of a book called Storm of Steel.